Hi there. In today's video, I'm going to talk about Tesla's most commonly asked interview questions. And the primary reason for doing this video is because I wanted to give you a couple of pointers as to how can you differentiate yourself from other candidates for the purpose of a job interview with them. I prepared here a little cheat sheet with the questions and with some of the key elements I wanted to highlight here. By the way, these questions are not very uncommon. I actually compared my list with ChatGPT's list. What's interesting about this is frequency. So ChatGPT's list is slightly outdated in terms of frequency. Some questions no longer get asked as often, whereas other questions get asked much more frequently here. The first and most commonly asked questions at Tesla by far is why Tesla, or Warum Tesla, or in less than 5 words, why Tesla, or what makes you qualified for the role. All right, so needless to say, is non-negotiable if you want to prepare for a job interview with them. And people don't expect this once per interview, but rather from each of their interviewers. Right, so it's that often. Now, how do you go about answering this in more peculiar ways if you want? One way would be that, hey, I'm not sure I want to join Tesla as of yet. For now, I'm just learning about the opportunity and see on whether my skills and abilities could make a difference here. Right, so this is the case, especially if you have multiple job offers, to be straightforward and to be upfront with them. This does actually happen, if you're wondering. The more standard way, but still a very strong way you'd want to go about this, if you want a framework, would be to go in two directions. First, you'd want to connect with Tesla's mission or values, if you want, to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy, which, by the way, we'll also get to a little bit later in the video. So how do you connect with Tesla's values? And second avenue you want to touch on is what can you bring to Tesla? What's your strength? How does your strength connect to a business outcome there? Okay, so and when I'm talking about strength, I'm not talking about something mentioned in the job description. I'm rather mentioning to your true strength here. Okay, so by touching on these two key areas, I found that your answers is most convincing if you want to go the standard way here. The second most commonly asked question in job interviews with Tesla is, describe one of your experiences from your resume, or tell me about this project on your resume, or what is your background experience and how can you be an asset to the company, or which project have you managed in the past which is related to this position. Okay, and actually these questions, tell me about one of your projects, is a behavioral question, which basically means they require a star answer of a time when you actually managed the project or a time when you dealt with that specific project. Reason for this being important is because interviewers expect you answer behavior questions with star answers. Okay, situation, task, action, and result. Okay, this is used in pretty much any high-performing companies these days. It's a highly successful way to screen candidates, so you'll score a few extra points only if you focus on providing your answers this format, the star format. And the other thing you want to keep in mind here is you have to be specific. Okay, specific examples will do best here. Now, what's also interesting to know is about this rather introductory question, describe one of your experiences from your resume, is that they often use this for what's called a deep dive test. And it's actually also Elon Musk who talks a lot about, or used to talk a lot about this test. That is one of the most efficient ways to screen candidates and to see on whether someone actually did a project. A deep dive, as the name implies, is to ask you a ton of follow-up questions and to deep prove your expertise. And what happens here is that candidates who did not own the project or did not prepare for the interview will have a hard time remembering all the details. Okay, so for example, if you didn't own a project, chances are you won't know a few key metrics about that project. Okay, and this is how you screen out candidates who do not seem that they own the project or they didn't prepare enough for the for the occasion. It's a highly efficient test. So how can you best prepare for such tests is to focus on preparing a story bank. Okay, this is in contrast with you just answering questions. To ensure you can answer any question for a job interview, like, I don't know, you prepare a list of 50 behavioral questions just to answer, you can answer any question, but rather to focus on depth of those stories. Prepare 10 stories which can fit eventually 50 behavior questions, but focus on depth for each of these stories. What can you remember about this? Some people go as far as to make a brain dump of several pages for one story, and then revise that story, trim down the fat and keep only the relevant and the more interesting details. Okay, this is the best approach if you want to prepare for deep dive tests. In general, it's also the most time consuming, of course, but this is what works. Okay, and by the way, these behavioral questions do get asked also for software engineers, so it's for any role, also at this company. Next question. Please tell us about yourself, or introduce yourself, or your elevator pitch. Dan, will you please introduce yourself? I'm an effective senior program manager with over 20 years of experience delivering complex programs for both government and the private sector, with successful track record of delivering multiple programs heavily geared towards IT, cloud, and business transformation, from design to implementation to handover and revenge recognition. Next question. What is the hardest challenge or technical challenge for technical roles that you faced recently? Or tell me about the time you solved a difficult problem. Or what is one of the biggest challenges you have came across? So again, a behavioral question. What is the hardest challenge you faced recently, right? So this requires an answer in the STAR format, since it's a behavioral question. And the way you'd go about answering these challenges and ensure they do sound like actual challenges would be to use a few metrics or quantifiers if you want, or if you're really good at communicating, you could also dramatize a few areas of your STAR answer, such as the task. You could eventually change the task with the challenge. Okay, so if you call it a challenge, maybe it's a bit dramatized, so it would actually show as more of a challenge during a job interview. What I've seen, people don't sell themselves well on their experiences here, and you risk here as making your story sound rather boring if the interviewer doesn't come up with follow-up questions to deprove if it was indeed challenging, whereas you can show it as challenging from your initial answer. So if your original answer is the best, then of course you're most likely to also do well during that job interview. Okay, what's an example of a challenge? Well, for a sales role, if sales are slow, what did you do to solve to solve that problem? Most likely you've done some sort of change, and any change project is hard. Okay, it's if you're a software developer, if you have to change something, for example, if you have to learn a new programming language, it's not as straightforward usually. So you must find a challenge, okay, and ensure you really remember all the details. And if I may give you a little hint here, when they say a challenge you faced recently, maybe translate that question into what's your best challenge. Okay, it doesn't have to be yesterday. Okay, if it's an interesting story, give what sells best for the purpose of a job interview, right? Next question. What was the time when you had a conflict with a teammate, and how did you handle it? How would you communicate with team members who disagree with you or with your plan? Right. So why would someone ask you for such questions during a job interview? Because they want to screen your interpersonal skills. Okay, how do you work with people who disagree with you? And even further, within a team context, how do you convince people of something? For more senior roles in particular, you would want to talk about how you influence. Okay, so your ability to influence in general. So um, how do you influence, or how do you work with people who disagree with you? Well, at an interpersonal level, you must build trust. This is the number one keyword you want to keep in mind for interpersonal questions. The second thing you want to pay attention to here is that oftentimes you can convince them with factual information, such as, you find some data that you convince someone who disagree with you, or you find that data for the purpose to find some common ground, to negotiate something that's beneficial for all stakeholders in a project. But also, if you're applying for a more senior role, you are most likely to also want to talk about the time when you influenced a decision. All right, which is again, matter of trust and working with factual information such as data. Now, if this sounds a little bit ambiguous to you, I'd like to also highlight here a few mistakes that people do, so you understand where do people fail these questions. People fail these questions when they come across as arrogant or disrespectful in interpersonal conflict. Also, people candidates can also make the mistake of blaming others for mistakes, and this is a super common interview problem. I've never expected it to be as common. Publicly criticize or humiliate others. Okay, not as common, but still pretty interesting to see on whether you could come across as having this problem. And just one closing tip here: cloning ChatGPT's answers will not work in such a scenario. Simply because the situation, it's not your story, and it will fail a deep dive test or a backbone test if you want. We'll talk about the backbone test a little bit later as well. Okay, so this would be about the conflict. Again, number 5 most commonly asked questions, so yes, it's also a must-have. Number 6, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Or what are your career goals in the next 5 or 10 years if you want? So this is a typical HR question. Okay, so I actually recommend, when building your elevator pitch, to bake this part, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years, into that, because it's music to HR's ears. If you want a few hints here, like some people would prefer individual contributor roles, whereas others will prefer manager level roles to go in the management direction. So this is one way you could think about your career trajectory, but I'm sure you know this even better than myself, as how do you want to go about this. I'm just giving you ideas here, since it's a surprisingly commonly asked question in Tesla interviews as of recently. Next question: strengths and weaknesses. Okay, what is your weakness, and what is one weakness you need to deal with? Or tell me about your core skills. Or interestingly, how would your closest friends describe you in 5 words? Okay, so this question is actually asking you for your strengths. What are your 3 strengths, if you want? Okay. Now, what you don't know, what you may not know, if you're just starting with behavioral interviews and all that stuff, is that finding your strength takes time. And oftentimes people feel like they should take their strength from the job description, which in my experience is not the best possible approach, simply because the job description is nothing more than a marketing manifesto as of these days. And second is, you won't correlate well with that strength. And the second challenge you experience while finding your strength is that, okay, you find a strength that you're happy with, but then you have to back it with a story. Okay, you want to talk about a story that showcases your strength. Chances are your best story will not contain that strength, so you must have to find a better strength that also maybe likely correlates with your best story. But long story short, finding your strength is worth. If you remember, we talked about why Tesla, and I said you can sell yourself on your strength, and selling yourself on your strength throughout the interview is also another good idea as a general piece of advice. As to weaknesses, the most commonly used weakness in job interviews for the past 5 or even more years is public speaking. And even further, everyone tends to back that weakness with attending Toastmasters. Okay, so you should know everyone does it. I've never heard of anyone getting disqualified for using this as a weakness, but you should know is boring. So if you want to differentiate yourself from other candidates, you must find something more interesting and try to not turn a positive into a negative. Okay, such as I work too hard. I don't think that sells best for the purpose of job interview. Or by the way, you're not good at interviewing would be another one that I'd never use for the purpose of job interview. All right. Next question. Tell us about a time when you had to solve a problem with little to no information. What types of problems have you faced and how did you solve them? So what this question is actually asking you here with little or no information, how do you deal with ambiguity? How do you decide in ambiguous situations? Okay, how is your decision making in ambiguous situations? There is an expression, great leaders are right a lot. Okay, probably simple to say that Elon Musk was right a lot, so then he became hugely successful. This actually works, and are right a lot happens to be a leadership principle at another company. So this is how you should think about this. That dealing with ambiguous situations highlights you as someone who's right a lot. Okay, and if this is too general, too vague to you, I would like to highlight what some of the best answers have in common when dealing with ambiguity would be people who are someone who's dealing well with ambiguity often applies experience to determine the best approach. Okay, so you use your experience to determine the best approach within the context of ambiguous situations, or seeks additional perspectives and data to arrive to the best decision. Okay, or recognize you cannot be always right when you lack expertise. Okay, so you can see they're also linked with each other, but this would be some of the main ingredients that you'd want to look at while dealing well with ambiguity. And maybe also some mistakes, some bad signs of dealing with ambiguity is when you don't seek perspectives, okay? Or when you rely on flawed logic. Okay, so flawed logic, of course you don't want to rely on flawed logic. I mean, but how do they get you in a job interview with your flawed logic? Well, usually using the backbone test. The backbone test, as the name implies, would be the interviewer challenges you with follow-up questions, and then during the pressure of the moment, you fail on it. And the simplest example I give is, for example, if you decide to paint your fence in red because you read an article that this sells well and attracts customers, and your interviewer says, I don't like the color red. I think blue would have been better because the sky is blue and everyone sees blue, so blue is better. And then you're in the heat of the moment. Oh my God, you're the interviewer. You're always right. It's not up to me here. Yes, you're right. We should have painted it in blue. Okay, this is how you fail a backbone test, in case you're wondering. So again, so we're talking about bad signs of a behavior of dealing with ambiguity. It relies on flawed logic. Okay, or the other extreme is you refuse to change your point of view if your interviewer is indeed right. Okay, so there's also the extremes here. Okay, so this would be how you go about dealing with ambiguity, and you'll see the more you revise your stories, the more you'll invest into finding your best story when dealing with ambiguity. You'll find these pointers as more revealing for you. Next one, walk me through a project you're the most proud of, or tell me about the project that really interested you, or what's your greatest achievement. Okay. So I call these questions as gifts. What's your best story? Tell me something interesting about you. What's the most interesting project? Okay, this is of course a answer which requires a star format. It's a behavior question. Tell me about a time when you had to deal with a interesting project, and this actually favors the people who actually have a story bank going into an interview versus the ones who just maybe Googled the most commonly asked questions and found an answer as quickly as possible for them. So you see, we talked about the deep dive, we talked about the backbone test. There are various tests to deep review expertise with these things, and this is of course nothing more. This type of question, nothing more than an entry point for a broader conversation. Okay, but again, I call these questions as gifts. Next question: what are your thoughts on the company's mission statement? Okay, so we talked about it. Tesla's mission to accelerate transition to sustainable energy and transportation. Okay, um, we talked about this. Ideally, you would want to bake into why Tesla, okay, to connect with Tesla's mission, and try to show an interesting keyword I heard was commercialism. If you sell, if you, especially technical candidates who can show commercialism, I found that do best as well, and probably also vice versa. If you're a salesperson, you talk about technicalities, you show them that you also care on the other side of things. You are curious. Okay, curiosity is also something that sells well in job interviews. Okay, next question: how do you deal with tight deadlines and multiple priorities? Or tell me about a time when you had to deliver under pressure. Or how do you cope with stressful situations? Or how do you handle stress? Okay, or how do you remain motivated during low periods? Okay, so how do you prove you're good with stress? With an example, okay, in the STAR format, by the way, because it's again a behavioral question. Three ideas for you here. First one, you talk about, or I could talk about, a failed startup I had. Okay, this would be the first. Second, second way to prove that you're good with stress. Some people tend to build routines or to change their habits so they are more stress resilient. For example, first thing in the morning used to be that I pick up my phone to, I don't know, check my mail. I replaced that habit with thinking for 5 minutes straight on how do I solve the most urgent problem or the most important problem I wanted to solve. Okay, just for 5 minutes. And by using this habit, it's a productivity hack, and it also helps releasing stress. Okay, because you feel progress, so you feel less stressed. Also, another interesting, the third idea I want to talk about here is preparing for an event can help you to cope well with stress. Simplest example is a job interview. Best prepared candidates actually transform stress into an accelerator to perform better, as a motivator during a job interview. And this is true, believe me, this actually happens. Okay, so these would be some examples, but I wouldn't go with preparing for a job interview would be the best way to handle with stress. No, preparing for, I don't know, preparing a cheat sheet for this YouTube video helped me to deliver, to communicate the idea that I want to transmit better. Okay, I could focus on the main things here. Next question, tell us about the time when you failed and how did you overcome this? Or tell me about the time when you failed. So this is a question, again, a behavioral question that it's not as often asked in job interviews with Tesla, but still a very important one to see if someone prepared for the job interview. I would challenge you, I would invite you right now to talk about the time when you failed in the STAR format. And from my experience, it will take you at least 3 attempts to find the proper failure story. And even less candidates would actually know that they should focus on the learnings that they had from that failure. I actually encourage, when providing your failure a STAR format, to give the results, the last part, to replace the results with the learnings, and furthermore, those results to be 50% of your answer. Simply because that's the main thing in a failure, other than faking the failure. So some people would say, oh, I won't talk about the failure in a job interview. I'm not a failure, I'm a success. Okay, so say I don't fail, sir, I only learn. Okay, so that would be another mistake. But the other one would be that you focus on the learnings. Some of the best candidates I had were able to sell themselves with failure stories, even for questions they didn't ask for a failure. So for example, if they ask you, tell me about a challenging project, you would talk about the failure to highlight the learnings and how you learn to deal with challenges successfully. Okay, so this is another interviewing technique that's pretty effective if communication is your thing. And if you know what you're doing with behavioral interviews, but I think it's pretty advanced for a job interview with Tesla. All right. And last but not least, how do you organize your time, or how do you manage your time and prioritize your tasks? Okay, so if you remember, how do you deal with ambiguity? How do you decide for ambiguous times? How do you manage your time and prioritize tasks? How do you prioritize? It's another sort of decision making, right? So all the advice that applies to dealing with ambiguity would also make sense here, or most of the advice. But furthermore, what's interesting, the best answers for prioritizations in general is and for decision making as well, is when they use frameworks. You associate the framework for your answer, not the star framework, but find something else that relates to your domain. For example, type 1 and type 2 decisions. Type 1 decisions being the ones that are easily reversible, where time is not of essence here. Well, I mean, when actually time is of essence, you must take them fast. For instance, if you get a requirement with ambiguous specifications, you must estimate a timeline for completing a project, and requirements are ambiguous, but you must do it fast. You know that decision is reversible. In other words, you could change your mind later on, so you can decide quickly, and that's type 1. Type 2 decisions is ones which cannot easily be reversed, so you must allocate proper time to decide them. For example, a wisdom tooth extraction is a non-reversible decision, so you must take your time to decide it, okay? Again, specific star answers, it's a behavioral question. I cannot emphasize this enough. It's super important you go with the star format, because you score a few extra easy points, because they hear something that's familiar to them, and this is why it sells best, right? So this would be the questions that are most commonly asked. I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.